Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Reimagining Climate Adaptation Summit. It's a great honour and privilege to welcome you all to the virtual room as we continue to explore adaptation challenges and opportunities for Australia and abroad. Yesterday we had a wonderful welcome to country delivered by Yvonne Weldon, and to continue that tradition, I too acknowledge the country on which we are all meeting here in Australia, and we indeed have speakers from around the world as well. For myself, I am on Ngunnawal country today, unceded lands, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Day 2 of our summit this week is really focused on enabling action. We are privileged to have a range of speakers from a range of backgrounds, government, at all levels of government, philanthropy, private sector and others, to share with us ideas, challenges and opportunities around enabling adaptation action and what that means for Australia and our global partners going forward. Yesterday, day 1 of our Reimagining Adaptation Summit, we heard from wonderful, diverse speakers on knowledge perspectives in Australia. First Nations people spoke eloquently and passionately and purposefully about how we treat knowledge, how we think about our worldviews and different perspectives, and what those can bring to the table as we reimagine our future together and get serious about what it means to adapt to a changing environment and changing climate. We were also very privileged to hear from our neighbours across the Pacific on the challenges and opportunities they are facing right now as climate impacts are felt and known in those regions. And we ended the day with an amazing panel looking at what it means to think about climate adaptation and mitigation as the yin and yang of what we need to be really serious about reimagining our shared futures in a diverse and changing climate. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful day 1. Day 2 will see us really drilling down into enabling action, as I've mentioned. We will be continuing the discussion of the urgency of transformative adaptation. We have a range of panelists. Your first panel will be looking at climate finance and tackling risk. Our second panel will be attempting to respond, and I think they're going to do it quite well, respond to this provocation of adaptation being everyone's business and really setting out for us who does what and how we might think about doing those things in partnership to enable efficiencies and build community. And our final session looks at the regulatory frameworks that are needed to not only drive this action and demonstrate leadership, but also support all the other stakeholders and actors in the room. So it's going to be a great day. We hope you can join us for all of those sessions. But right now we have the immense privilege of a keynote session delivered by Marcelo Mena. Marcelo Mena is a scientist and professor turned activist and policymaker. He's the director of the Climate Action Centre at the Catholic University of Valparaiso and the Chile office of the Global Centre on Adaptation. Previously, he was the practice manager in climate research at the World Bank and the former vice minister and minister of the environment for Chile under President Bachelet from 2014 to 2018. He has spearheaded multiple environmental initiatives such as taxes on new car sales and power generation based on local and global air pollution, the first of their kinds globally. He has helped craft a landmark agreement to phase out coal power generation, creating 45,000 square kilometres of national parks, protecting 1.3 million square kilometres of ocean, and instituted the first national plastic bag ban in the Americas. So a very impressive portfolio and range of experience. Whilst at the World Bank, Marcelo helped create the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, This coalition includes 53 ministers, and together they manage $2.9 trillion a year in national budgets, or 10% of global GDP, and they contribute to the Action Plan on Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience. So there are a number of people taking adaptation, resilience and mitigation very, very seriously. And we're so honoured to hear from Marcelo, his perspectives and his work and range of sectors over the years. So with that, thank you, Marcelo. I'm going to hand over to you to deliver the keynote for day 2 of the Reimagining Summit.
Thanks so much, Tayanah. And this is, so I'm Marcelo. I'm going to give you a talk going through some of the things that we have that we had just discussed, talking about adaptation and mitigation, and how net zero is actually the fastest, best pathway for Chile to develop and to address multiple challenges. Just a second. I'm gonna, there you go. Let me just stop this. Just 1 second. I got to turn off the. No, I'll just keep on going. The thing is, I've got the closed caption in Spanish, and it's just writing down whatever it understands. When I was at the World Bank, I remember that climate change was very important, a very important issue to be addressed by multiple actors, and actually around 35% of the volume of the World Bank is associated to climate change. And the reason being is that climate change and global poverty are two sides of the same coin. Both challenges must be addressed together. If we fail on one, we will fail on the other. And that's something that we are seeing day to day with the different challenges that we're facing. And Nick Stern wrote that a couple of years ago. If we're looking into what the amount of challenges that we need to do to overcome to really face climate change, for those that haven't followed, to reach the Paris Agreement set out a goal of keeping warming well below 2 degrees, hopefully looking at 1.5 degrees warming. And to achieve this, we need to have a large shift in emissions, something that we haven't really done before in our history. But things change fast, and we never expected something like the COVID crisis to occur. But the reality is, emissions did decrease. But the thing is that we need to do this not just because we're not doing the activities that we used to do, but actually doing this in a structural manner to reduce these emissions, to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. And if we looked at how far we've gone in these last couple of years, you can see really that things have changed, and they're looking up with regard to the previous years. In 2019, right before COP25, if we looked at all the commitments globally, you could see that most of the commitments globally are misaligned with a global, preventing warming for 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. And our current, the current commitments then, a couple of years ago, was roughly a 3-degree warming. If we all actually met our commitments, so we're all pretty misaligned. And if everybody followed everybody else's pattern, we'd be talking about a 3 to 4 or 4+ degree warming world. But last year wasn't a year that was lost. If we compare 2018 projections to 2020 projections, at the end, with the commitments from China, from Korea, Japan, and ultimately from the US, we're actually looking into the realm of keeping warming closer to 1.5 degrees than we expected. We still have a monumental task ahead, but all hope is not lost. And 2020 was most definitely not a lost year in terms of climate commitments. But this is done. Everything that's going on is in the middle of a sanitary social crisis. And the thing is, in Latin America, I just wanted to talk to you about that a little bit. We've had comparatively a worse response to COVID than other regions. And as Kristalina Georgieva, my former boss at the World Bank and now at the IMF, said, that we're about to deploy a enormous amount of fiscal stimulus, and we could do it in a way that tackles both crises at the same time, both the sanitary crisis, the health crisis, and the climate crisis that's ensuing, that will unfold within this decade. We must do everything that we can in our power to make it a green recovery. And why should we do this for Latin America? Because we have a lot of our assets exposed. Every year, the Global Climate Risk Index puts out all the climate-related, damage, and you can see that a lot of this damage, comes in multiple ways. In the case of Chile, most of this damage has occurred within the last 3 years, and this is on average around $450 million in losses. But for example, sometimes in Peru in 2017, I remember they had some unseasonal rains, coastal rains that cost 6 billion in GDP loss, which is huge. Or what you could see as an average loss in Bangladesh, almost $2.2 billion in losses per year for the last 2 decades. So we're talking about things that are compiling, compounding, and becoming more intense with time. I recently wrote a paper for the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs called "The Green and Resilient Recovery for Latin America," and one of the conclusions that we came to is this inequality being the Achilles heel to any response we could have to COVID. When we deploy any sort of social protection, when we have 50% of some workers not having a contract, having no health insurance or pension funds, or not even being registered within any social protection system, then they fall out of the safety nets. And when we want them to stay at home for a quarantine, this just doesn't occur because people need to feed themselves and they bypass that. And that has caused the issues we see in Mexico, in Chile, in Brazil, and we even thought Uruguay had been largely missed from this problem of the COVID pandemic, and now they're also in very high transmission rates and death rates. So the thing is, this inequality is also an issue for us to address if we want to deploy the same type of support in terms of climate change. We are physically more vulnerable as a region than the rest of the world, twice as vulnerable, and our risk to well-being, the assets, the services that are provided by the assets that could be hurt by the climate crisis are also much more exposed than the rest of the world. And the GDP loss, all the progress that we can make in the Caribbean or Central America can be lost within a couple of, a full decade of progress could be lost if we do not prevent climate change, if we do not adapt. So the good news with this very bleak outcome and prediction is that we already know that mitigating climate change on a global scale has multiple benefits. The benefits of having cheaper energy, the investments that are done, cleaner air and avoided air pollution, increased inclusion in the jobs that are created, and higher GDP growth. And this is something that, as Nick Stern says, this is the growth story of the 21st century, in which climate-related investments will be the ones that really take a big brunt of the investment that we will be carrying out within these decades. But also, when I was at the World Bank, we put out this report with the Global Center on Adaptation that for the first time showed that if we invest in adaptation, there's much more benefits than cost. If we spend on an early warning system, we have a huge increase in the amounts of benefits in comparison to the cost. If we invest in resilient infrastructure or in resilient agriculture, if we protect ecosystems and keep them healthy, so they provide their ecosystem services and provide us safety towards these events, climate-related events, then we have a huge case to invest in adaptation. And only spending 3% additional cost can make some infrastructure resilient. And another lesson here to be learned is that when we spend on adaptation, when we invest in adaptation, we're not only climate proofing the investments themselves, but the activities that are supported. So therefore, the climate related damage of a water shortage or is not from the water being interrupted. What we want to prevent there is not necessarily the cost of the infrastructure that we want to replace. It's not pipes that we want to replace if a flood occurs, but really it's the activities that are halted when we have interruption of services. So therefore, investing in adaptation and infrastructure like water, sanitation, or in the case of electrical supply, is to keep the activities going, and that's why there's so many benefits in comparison to the cost. Now, the other thing that's important to understand here is that that with time we've also learned that that protecting the ecosystems, the things that we have just described that we did in the government, was that that we are able to provide more agriculture, forestry, and tourism, according to a paper by Waldron and others from University of Cambridge, which showed for the first time that that we should have protected ecosystems, and that protecting 30% of the globe, as the Biodiversity Convention from the UN states and recommends, we will have 5 times more benefits than costs. So for the first time, we're seeing evidence that we don't only need to mitigate and adapt, and these are investments that are good for the economy, but also if we protect ecosystems, we also have these benefits. And in Chile, we're, just as Australia, we have a, a conflict between some activities, and we have a lot of mining. And so when we want to protect the glaciers from mining operations, immediately the mining sector says we will lose a lot of our GDP. But the contradiction is that most of the water in central Chile is provided by glaciers that are melting and that will disappear if we keep warming, if we don't keep it under 1.5 degrees. So therefore, this contradiction we need to really resolve and understand what services are provided by them and really value them and what they are worth to our economy. And so one of my colleagues put out a report saying that, that if we were to replace the infrastructure that the glaciers provide to hold water for free, it would cost way more than the mining sector provides. And we're not saying that we shouldn't mine at all, but what we're saying is that you should really constrain these activities so as to not really hurt these green infrastructure features in the glaciers that we want to protect. And so the biggest example that shows that there is no contradiction between conservation and economy is, for example, the island which Dominican Republic and Haiti co-inhabit, in which you could see the deforestation in Haiti and the circles of poverty and landslides and lost forest cover, and they are actually a country that protects way less of their ecosystems than Dominican Republic. And one country has a GDP per capita, I think it's almost 100 times to 1, Dominican Republic versus Haiti. So this is something that we need to understand, that when we protect natural capital, when we protect ecosystems, and we could protect the infrastructure that they provide, green infrastructure that they provide, and the services, then we're really maintaining the richness of a country in particular. So when I was getting my PhD, I remember that we went to the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, in which we were taught, these different things on climate and health. I remember Professor Paul Epstein from Harvard, may he rest in peace. He would do and show a lot of research he was doing for the reinsurance companies, like Swiss Re or Munich Re. Reinsurance companies are companies that pay and foot the bill when insurance companies can't foot the bill. And to them, the climate agenda wasn't something that really mattered in terms of belief, because they were just seeing and paying for a bill that was increasing in size every year. So they didn't care if whether countries believe in climate change or not, or whether but because they were just they wanted to address this issue because they understood that this needed to be addressed, because they're just paying a bill that could become unpayable in the future. What I want to reflect on here is that they recently put out a report last year on biodiversity loss and how vulnerable different countries are to ecosystem failure, collapse. Around 50% of global GDP depends on healthy ecosystems. Around 20% of global ecosystem countries actually have are at the risk of ecosystem collapse. And if there's any example of whether we should be taking care of biodiversity, it should be the fact that we're doing this remotely. That I unfortunately I can't be with you guys in Australia because today, we have this crisis that has really shifted how things, how everything, how everything is carried out. Um, um, so I want to just say that one of the examples that I see that are most compelling regarding how much we've changed the the world is this paper that was put out by National Geographic researchers for the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which they showed that around 96% of the mammals in the world, land mammals, are actually either livestock or human beings, and only 4% of all mammals globally are wild, and around 70% of all birds in the world are actually poultry, and only 70% are wild. So in this regard, then, so we have this big problem. I'm going to go from the Latin American perspective to the Chilean perspective. When we talked for the Mexican government, for the CELAC, which is a group of Latin American countries in front of around 10 ministers of foreign affairs from Latin America, we showed first thing that we need to address. The COVID crisis has caused 5 million extremely poor people to increase in this last 2020. So Latin America is poorer now than it was a year ago after the COVID pandemic. But climate change could add another 5 million more if we do not become a more resilient continent. And so we need to have better, social services, social spending, and we need to protect marginalized communities. But the second thing that we need to understand is that we need to have a green recovery that allows us to become more resilient, in which we do investments, and so we are better prepared for the next disaster season. Emergency employment programs that allow us to tackle resilience with, lowly qualified people that actually could just clean up a river, or for example, remove debris, so landslides or fires are less frequent than they would be. Investing in resilient infrastructure. If we only have 3% additional spending on capital costs by good planning and design, we could actually prevent around $700 billion in net benefits to our economies by 2030. And this is something that we need to do to also clean water, etc. This picture here is in Santiago. Santiago, fell prey to landslides and unseasonal rains in 2015 and 17, in which the rain occurred in the summer when it's not supposed to rain at all, and that caused the water outages that lasted a couple days. Since then, investments have been carried out from the private sector with a regulatory scheme that allows transfer investments into the water tariffs. And this is actually one of the biggest private sector investments globally on adaptation. It's a $130 million investment that allows the city to store water for around 4 to 5 days of treated water. Whereas if there's any interruption of the initial new supply of water, we have around a week to get back online. And this allows us to be more resilient to these ever more frequent events. This is something that I think is a really interesting example of how regulation and the private sector could work together to invest in adapted infrastructure. Another thing that we need to do nationally and locally is to regulate the financial sector, so we recognize the value of climate risk. And so right now, the Chilean pension fund system and the private sector has mandatory climate-related financial disclosures starting in July this year, which is a big shift from previous efforts. So I think it's really important because we have a very active private sector, and if we're able to have our pension fund system or our private sector recognize the value of adaptation, then we'll be better along the way. Also, investing in green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. There's multiple examples in which forest covers increasing. In the case of Costa Rica, has allowed increased resilience and increased carbon capture, and we need to learn from those good examples. And also, we need to have better investment systems so we are able to include climate change in our public investment. Therefore, our hard-earned public investments are climate proofed and not lost because of the short-sightedness of the design that we carry out. And we do this in Chile too. There's always room for improvement, but public investments do undergo climate-related risk greening, and this makes our designs more resilient. Finally, another recommendation that we did was that we need to have the World Bank and the IMF walk the talk on these issues, because a lot of the things that the World Bank does is pointing towards climate-related investments, but when countries want to have a big cash flow being done for these IMF type loans, there's no climate-related strings attached, and the reality is that countries are spending less on climate change for this stimulus than they were for the global financial crisis in 2008. So we need to do more. And I'll just do in the last portion of this talk, I'm going to give you some examples of what Chile is doing now, just for you to know and understand why we're shifting toward net zero. First off, Chile's new nationally determined contribution, which is a climate commitment in the context of the Paris Agreement. They need to be updated every 5 years. The first one was in COP21, and 5 years later, we're due, every country, including Australia, has to have a new climate commitment. Ours has a net zero target by 2050, 50% reduced emissions by 2030, and we have a carbon budget. And this puts us in line with the most advanced economies in terms of the commitments and how it is being done, which is good. The good thing about the Chilean net zero target is that we see, and we've done a lot of different studies from the IDB and the World Bank, is that it will increase investment, lower operational costs and net costs, and therefore also have a net increase in our GDP. So the Chilean nationally determined contribution actually will bring increased growth, which is a good news. This has allowed us to become world leaders in renewables. And for example, if you look at our 14 billion in investments for renewables last decade, which a lot of it occurred in the last 2 to 3 years, is actually, if you look at our 17 million people, we're actually around $700 per capita invested in renewables, which is pretty good. And this has allowed us to become the first, the #1 market, according to Climatoscope by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, for emerging markets, which is a good thing. The fundamentals of our markets are good. We have carbon prices, emission standards, and all these things that allow us to have better competitiveness between technologies. Good things, just want to run you through some latest data from the levelized cost of energy for different technologies. And the good news today, globally, but even more so in Chile almost 5 years ago, new renewables are cheaper than coal, oil, and very close to natural gas, which is a good news if you want to mitigate. Second thing, it's cheaper to build new renewables and to continue to operate existing coal and oil, and very soon natural gas. Number 3, solar battery storage will become cheaper than coal pretty soon, and it is already cheaper than oil. And this unleashes a whole bunch of different tipping points and changes and shifts. First off, as we said, it's cheaper to build new solar than run existing coal because of carbon taxes and other things. Then we have a coal phase-out agreement that was achieved within the government of President Bachelet, which has our 40% power generation that was done by coal by 2018 to be phased out by 2040, something that we should do it by 2030, but it was a great agreement because it allowed us to understand that we had to put a ring on the finger of understanding that we were already not building any new coal. The power sector was understanding that operating existing coal was more expensive, and we just said let's just call it, let's just name that tune, and that tune is there's no more coal in Chile by 2040 by commitment, by 2030 most likely, which is good news. And this has allowed us to think of other revolutions. Battery storage is going to occur in Australia, in Chile, very soon. And the prices that are coming down are going so fast that we're going to be able to unleash this within the next 5 years. Also, we have a new CSP plant operating, and we need to provide more incentives for this baseload solar energy, concentrated solar power that will allow us to have 24/7 renewable energy. We have also benefited from the dropping cost of battery storage, and today around 10% of the buses in Santiago are electric buses, and they're working and operating at a 70% operational cost, which allows us to think of 100% electrical buses by 2030. And this is the largest fleet of electric buses outside of China, and we're very proud of this achievement. But this comes at minimum emission standards that are already very stringent and allows us to take a leap that's less big from electric buses from the Euro 6 basic emission standard that we have as a national regulation. And so a lot of the things that we do, all the measures is the mitigation abatement cost curve for Chile. Around 75% of the measures are cost negative. But when we integrate air pollution benefits, this actually increases fivefold. So therefore, we're in no regrets zone in terms of mitigation. And we see that there will be an increased contribution of electrical power into our whole energy use. Now, I'm going to go to the final phase, talking about what other things mean for Chile in terms of climate change and what will happen if other countries fulfill their own commitments. First off, the World Bank put out a report that says that there's going to be a lot more demand for minerals, copper and lithium, if we're able to meet the net zero emissions targets that the countries have. Chile is one of the most extractive economies in the OECD. We generate very little wealth for the amount of materials that we extract, but this will not change in the short term, because the energy demand for clean energy will actually double copper demand and multiply lithium demand by tenfold. And Chile itself is very exposed to potential border taxes for emissions. We look more like a fossil fuel country in terms of the embodied emissions in the copper that we export. And we're very worried about the border tax that the EU has announced for emissions. And so this puts a burden on us to become cleaner with the way that we make copper. And there's multiple initiatives to have net zero copper. And most mining companies are signing 100% renewable energy contracts that are actually cheaper than what they used to be paying for coal. We have a lot of solar potential, and we need to make use of it and transform the energy in other ways. We have 70 times more energy than we're actually using today as economically feasible. And so therefore, we recently launched a green hydrogen strategy in which we believe that we could provide cheap green hydrogen, like Australia also intends. We believe that our lower energy cost overall puts us in line to have the cheapest green hydrogen in the planet. And this actually could be a really interesting shift from our extractive-based economy and create an industry that is as large as the Chilean mining sector, almost 10% of our GDP, and a cumulative investment of around $330 billion will be required to meet this goal. So we're very excited about this, and we hope to make it happen. What I just described was something that has to do with not just ministers of environment wanting to do commitments, but actually a new way of developing. So therefore, that's why I just wanted to talk about finally the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action and what it could achieve and how we should really see climate change as an opportunity for development and investment and reducing energy costs. And so when I was at the World Bank, we put together around 20 Sherpas for different ministers of finance, and we put together what was called the Helsinki Principles. And a lot of the things that we just heard are precisely that: putting a price on carbon, mainstreaming climate change into public investment, including climate change into the private sectors, mobilized funding from the private sector. And this is actually growing very fast. Last slides, we've seen that asset managers are putting increasing amount of pressure on on companies to have climate related mitigation goals. And this is very good news. The US has recently joined the Network for Greening the Financial System with the Federal Reserve. And also last week, the US joined the Coalition of Finance Ministers. So now we're thinking about 60% of global GDP is involved, and around 40% of global emissions are committed to these Helsinki principles, which is great news. The World Bank also recently aligned its operations to the Paris Agreement. After Trump left, the president of the World Bank has now the free road to do this, and this is good news. And last slide, we're in the middle of this decisive decade. We need to go towards climate, carbon neutrality. We could do so by investing, by creating jobs, by reducing pollution. We could create resilience. We cannot have a recovery for countries paying, and have our children pay for this with debt if we are also indebting their climate future. So the question is, where should we go? Which direction should we take? Which pill should we ingest? We know the outcome of that red pill. And I just wanted to say, I hope you also believe that we should go for that green pill. Thank you. I'm sorry, I went a couple of minutes extra, but yeah, anyway, thank you.
No, it's no problem at all. Thank you so much, Marcelo. That was a wonderful presentation. For those who have been joining throughout our keynote for day 2, my name's Tayanah O'Donnell. I'm the Executive Director of Future Earth Australia, based at the Australian Academy of Science in Canberra. And it's our great pleasure to be working in partnership with the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney and the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University to pull together this Reimagining Climate Adaptation Summit. Thank you all for joining us in the virtual room. Marcelo, we're going to go to questions in a moment, but I just want to recap a few highlights of many. I have a full page here of highlights, so I'm not going to be able to do it all justice. But there were a few key points I felt that you touched upon, and I'd just like to recap those. You started off by talking about green recovery and the need to be cognizant of the significant losses due to climate change impacts, and then how we can think about the green recovery, not just from COVID, but also of climate impacts in terms of social investment, social infrastructure, responsible adaptation and resilience, thinking about inequality and embedding, addressing inequalities into all of our adaptation and resilient responses, as well as our investments in mitigation efforts. You gave us a range of examples, really great examples of climate mitigation efforts from around the world, particularly in Latin America and South America, and gave some examples of public-private partnerships. So we really saw there that it's not just the private sector who are leading, although they do need to, but also governments, and the need for serious investment, and for that investment to come with strings attached. So we want to fund these new developments and enterprise to respond to adaptation, but we need to make sure that that's where the money's going and to measure it accordingly. Mm-hmm. Finally, you ended with the note that climate change is an opportunity for investment in socially responsible development. And it's interesting to note that today, Joe Biden, the new US president, is hosting a clean tech jobs summit and is pushing very hard on climate policy and demonstrating leadership from the United States of America. So I think there's lots lots for us to think about in this Q&A session.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you again for such a rich talk. I'm going to now go to our Q&A box here. We've got some excellent questions. I might start at the top. We've got a question here. A participant, Estefania, I hope I've said your name correctly there. She says, thank you for your presentation. Coming from Bolivia, I'm very familiar for the need and urgency to accelerate climate change action. Most of the times we see that adaptation actions planned don't always address on the ground problems. Can you perhaps share some perspectives on why you think this happens, given that we have lots of knowledge on adaptation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I remember some of the most successful World Bank type projects are actually within with locally led action, what they would call, would be deploying funding at the most granular level possible, because local communities are the ones that understand which river is going to cause the more risk, or the fire, etc. So I think the adaptation itself has two challenges. It has a sectoral challenge because it's not a climate issue, it's a sectoral issue. It's how you design a road, it's how you design a coastal protection, and it is a sectoral challenge. And the way to make it visible to them is actually just to think about it, right? So climate risk screening is a way that the World Bank does it, in which they just say, okay, you thought it's going to rain this frequently, but this is now the next climate. Is it designed for this or not? And with good planning, you don't need to do a lot of problems with that, because you will be able to include that. But also in the funding way, there should be, and the World Bank is working on a climate-related climate resilience rating system, in which you rate a design, and you will benefit a good design when it includes climate change better. It will have better financial terms. When it's a risky design, it'll have worse financial terms, just on general level. Thing is, what Estefania is saying is that which is, I also agree, is that you need to have this done on a decentralized manner, because many times these decisions are done in countries, in the capital city, and seldom have the local feel. So therefore, needs to be a lot of public participation, so people are aware of the challenge that needs to be addressed, but also are part of the solution, are proposing the solution, and also feel that the solution is done together. So that's why I think I agree that's an issue that should be done and addressed. It should be locally aware and sensitive with a lot of public participation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And indeed, a lot of adaptation literature and practice really tries to connect those top-down frameworks and leadership that we know we need, and the localized bottom-up knowledge and perspectives. And sometimes they don't always quite connect, but we need to keep trying. And it leads quite nicely into a question we have here from Andrew, who also thanks you for a great presentation. His question is, given the very positive benefit cost ratio of adaptation, what is needed to accelerate investment in adaptation by governments and the private sector? You gave some good examples of innovations in adaptation investment in Chile. What lessons could be applied to other parts of the world, and in particular to our part of the world here in Australia and across the Pacific?
Mm-hmm. I remember that, these downtimes with Kristalina Georgieva, traveling around the world with her and having these reflections, because I would write speeches for her and just try to pick her mind, and etc. She came really great conclusion. She said, we've been able to do mitigation because we price pollution, and we've been able to incorporate this, and we try to level the playing field of technologies, and this has allowed us to really flourish. And the investments in mitigation are probably around 700, 800 billion dollars a year, right? Huge amounts of funding on this, because we're able to really recognize this as something we need to do. But on adaptation, that's why we put out that report, Adapt Now. We were really faced with a challenge, because there really is no silver bullet on adaptation except pricing risk. You need to make climate risk visible in the decision-making process, whether you're designing a specific public investment or whether you're looking at whether you're going to invest in a specific portfolio for a country. Climate-related financial disclosures can do wonders. Once you start that conversation, once you obligate the companies to disclose their risk, they have to address it. And this same goes with how you price this and transfer this. In the case of Chile, for example, we have a tariff system in which water was priced on its quality and service overall. But the thing is, the way that we had done this tariff was the regulator didn't recognize a company that was resilient to be a good company because it was inefficient. And the thing is, it was absurd because you're just thinking about the next couple of years, really weren't thinking the future. So the thing is, as long as you're able to expand the way that you analyze things, that's the first way. You know, what Mark Carney, from the former governor of the Bank of England, would say, the tragedy of the horizon. Do not, have the horizon be, if we have a discount rate that's too high, the future is invisible. Same goes here. If you're able to transfer a risk to somebody, then you will be able to include that into your decision-making process. So the thing is, the way that she did it is that we finally recognized that a resilient company was a good company, and therefore they could invest that and transfer it to the end user. And that's how we intend to replicate to make our electrical system more resilient too. That's because somebody's got to pay for it, either through taxes or through a tariff. But it's got to be priced. And if it's not priced, you're not going to really invest in resilience at all.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Marcelo, for those comments. We have another 4 questions, and I'm going to combine or attempt to combine 2 of them. These 2 are from Juan and also from Claudia. Juan says, "Gracias, Marcelo. What are the prospects in the constitutional process currently underway in Chile to enshrine some of these urgently needed changes in a new constitution? Can you have a biocentric or ecological constitution? Is something like that possible? And can constitutional change lead to deep societal change?" Claudia's question also thanks you. She says she's very familiar with the underlying problems in Latin America, that it's surprising and frustrating that many Latin American countries are committed to the UNFCCC, but we still fail to mainstream ecosystems in adaptation and have a more holistic view to enable adaptation. She says there's a preference for hard options and changing policies is hard. What are the options or opportunities to overcome some of these structural barriers? And I wondered if one question perhaps talked to the other, which is why I've given you both. Over to you.
Yeah, first thing, thank you. So as many of you may know, we had a social unrest in 2019 that led to a constitutional process. So we have a constitutional referendum in which 80% roughly of the population said we need a new constitution because it's a barrier to the society that we want to create. And it's a barrier in the sense that the Pinochet's dictatorship-born constitution was very much individualistic in nature and gave the private sector a lot of leeway, but very little work for the collective, work that we could have. And so once this came out, we, with a whole bunch of professors and former government officials, we came out with a Green Constitution Decalogue, in which we have around 100 candidates that have committed to this. And so one of the concepts that we need to include is the concept of intergenerational justice, fighting climate change, protecting biodiversity, prioritizing human consumption in water use, because today water is privatized in Chile, and multiple other things. So it is an opportunity, but the biggest opportunity is to think ahead and think, and not only in our generation, but future generations. This has multiple benefits that my former Minister of Finance friends also like, because they like the fact that you can't indebt yourself too much. And you have to think in future generations if you're going to, spend more than you're able to collect. So I think it's a good concept, and I think we have a good opportunity. And it's not misaligned to what I just said, because it just makes us think, not only in the next year or the next 4 years like a president does, but in the long term. That's long-term thinking that our Constitution doesn't have today. In terms of what Claudia was saying about ecosystems, I think it's really great point that she brings, because the thing is, what Latin America doesn't need hasn't come to terms yet, and also the developing world, or the new world like Australia, is that Europe lost most of their ecosystem services. A lot of their green infrastructure was destroyed. And I remember a designer, I was recently with the German government. They're talking about coastal design, and we're talking about design criteria, et cetera, et cetera. And it was really great discussion. But then the guy says, but you guys shouldn't make the same mistake we did. We're doing all this gray infrastructure because we don't have any green infrastructure to protect us anymore. And what you guys have to understand is that if you're able to keep coastal ecosystems healthy, wetlands that are healthy, mangroves, etc., you'll save so much money, because we have to spend all this stuff on cement when we could have just kept the ecosystems in a healthy manner as we should have. So I think in that regard, nature-based solutions, we need to do much more and believe in ourselves as a region, because it makes total sense. And so now my biggest take-home message from that is that I think we should protect all wetlands, all coastal wetlands. There's not one single one that does not provide ecosystem services and makes us more resilient and having better livelihoods associated to all the other better fisheries, et cetera, that we get from coastal ecosystems that are healthy. So I believe that too. And I believe that we just believe in ourselves, because the thing is, we look at manuals done in the US and Europe, et cetera, but nobody's going to write our story. Our story, our ecosystems are ours, are not well understood by the developed world, and we should really make our biggest efforts to conserve those ecosystems so they can help conserve us in retribution.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are nearing the end of our time together, but I am going to try and squeeze in two more questions. One, I think, is quite a short question from Adriana, who would like to know your opinion about carbon bonds. And then we have a much larger question.
Okay, climate bonds, I think, I would say climate bonds, I imagine it's carbon or climate bonds. That's a really good way for countries to get a lot of funding. If they are Paris aligned, there's a lot of demand. Chile has issued around $7 billion in green bonds and climate related bonds. And we've done well with this because the interest rates that we've gotten are very low. So if we want to do a green recovery, there's huge demand from investors globally if we are to do this, especially if it's Paris aligned. Therefore, it'll not be, airports and highways or power plants that are fossil fuel related, but actually investing in green infrastructure, in solar energy, solar rooftops, and metro system, electric buses, as we have done so with the $6 or $9 billion, I lost track of green bonds that we've submitted up to now. So I think it's a really great opportunity to get low interest rate funding if you're committing to make your country more climate adapted or investing in mitigation. So I think it's a really good opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have two questions here from Mark, and I think I'm going to go with the first one, where he says, great and encouraging talk. Thank you very much. Could you please say more? And I'll just flag now too, this will be the last question. Can you please say more on what will overcome self-interest and power dynamics associated with the rich to really reduce inequalities, both between countries and amongst individuals, and how can adaptation help with this?
So today we're in the middle of a quarantine, and we're probably going to be hitting a whole bunch of GDP loss because we're have a nationally mandated quarantine. And the thing is, we're not lifting ourselves up and we're not working. And the thing is, having had a better social system, having had better social protection, would have allowed us to have better response. We look at Australia and New Zealand, equally isolated. Chile is very isolated, really, in terms of physically from other countries. And we could have been the New Zealand and the Australia had we had a social protection system. And this same goes with climate change. So the thing is, our rhetoric today is that the Achilles heel towards our development is inequality, and no country has reached development with the level of inequality Chile has today. So therefore, if it's in our best interest to make that last jump from becoming a high middle income country to a high income country, is because it is through addressing inequality, having better prepared professionals, having more people working. We lost a decade of female participation in the workforce with this pandemic. We have 90% of the job losses were women. So the thing is, inequality is the enemy of our development, and that's the way we try to pose it. And hopefully we'll get the private sector to understand. If there's any lesson, is that this inequality brought us to a point in which we almost wanted to burn down the country. So the thing is, that is a warning that I think the private sector and the rich should understand, and that you need to have these reforms done, or else you won't have riches to protect at all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm tempted to squeeze in one more question, just because we have a few more minutes, if you may indulge me, please. It's another question from Mark. His question is, in the long term, is it okay to argue that adaptation or indeed mitigation will increase with GDP growth if that means consumption continues to rise, even if that rise is with lower emissions, putting pressure on other resources? So another big question.
That's a huge trade-off and discussion, and a lot of people don't buy what they call 2.0 extractive nation, and solving the issues with with the problems with the same mentality that caused the problems that we have today. But I think these trade-offs do have net benefits. One of the big trade-offs that we're undergoing is the tension with the lithium extraction in our salt lakes in the north of Chile. There's a lot of very fragile ecosystems, and that will be actually hit if we increase lithium extraction by a lot. And so a lot of people, I got an electric car. A lot of people give me a lot of hard time because I've got an electric car. I'm sort of, I'm killing the ecosystems. But I'm saying, 50 kilograms of lithium are a lot less than 2,000 liters of petrol every year. Right, so we got to find a way to understand, that these trade-offs need to be done, and so that's why I'm, it's a struggle that we're going to be having. My point of view is that we could shift from this old economy to a new economy through more extraction. The thing is, we could either extract the rest of the copper and have nothing to pay for it at the end, or we could use this transition for building a green hydrogen economy and renewable energy economy. And that's, I think, the way that we have to do it. We need to have more extraction in the interim, but the thing is, only if we have this shift in our eyesight towards the future will we have a more sustainable economy for the future in the long run.
Thank you. Thank you for indulging that final question. And indeed, thank you very much for your time. I know it's late over there in Chile, and we're very honoured to have had you join us for the opening keynote of day 2 of our Reimagining Climate. Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure.
And great public. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks everyone. Please join us again for our next session starting in about an hour's time. With that, we will sign off and look forward to continuing to engage with you all in the virtual room over the coming days.